The parents suddenly realize there's no escaping this. We all live on one planet, and it's no good arguing about which end of the boat is sinking. We're all in it together.
Welcome to Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm Carol Spalding, your host, and today we have with us Hazel Henderson, a futurist, an evolutionary economist, and an author of many books. We'll welcome you.
Thank you.
What is an evolutionary economist?
Well, change is happening faster and faster in the world, and it's not surprising that economic textbooks are having a hard time catching up. And a lot of economists have in the past looked at the economy in rather a stationary way, and now they're having to look, at a more dynamic picture. In fact, you hear these discussions going on Capitol Hill. Should they use dynamic numbers or should they use static numbers?
What does that mean, dynamic
Well,
numbers?
what it means is that you're taking into account all of the other changes that are going on, so that if you do a tax cut or if you change interest rates, there's immediate feedbacks from all of these other areas of the economy. And so economists are really having to become systems thinkers, So really that's what the whole idea of evolutionary economics.
Well, you've been involved with economics and economists for a long time. In fact, you've sort of blazed your own trail, and now it looks like maybe this is bringing it more to the philosophy that you've been trying to talk about for a number of years.
Well, I'm one happy camper right now, I have to say. And it's partly because of this new globalization set of issues, where everybody from the head of state of a country all the way down to families are having to deal with these forces of globalization. And for heads of state, they say, well, my gosh, my country's losing sovereignty. And, for the business community, it is, how do we globalize our marketplace? How do we globalize our production? How do we establish a global brand? And for local communities, it's how do we deal with all of these companies and things coming in from the outside? And of course, for every family, they, in one way or another, they're dealing with globalization.
I think that's true, but I think people see that as a threat sometimes. When we had the treaties that open trade to Mexico, for example, and jobs move out of hometowns into places in the Philippines or wherever they might be. People see that as a threat. What do you see it as?
Well, there is good news and bad news, and of course it depends where you are in the system. And if you're one of those people whose company is going to go offshore, it is certainly bad news. And that's why there has to be a lot more consideration of lifelong learning and of continually upgrading people's skills. So, the whole idea really of constantly retraining and learning new skills, economists are getting their mind around the idea of human capital. I mean, we have to invest in people. People are the wealth of nations.
I don't think many capitalists see it that way.
Well, in a way they do, because they run around the world. Like right now, Silicon Valley couldn't run if they weren't bringing Indian programmers in. The Indians produce great mathematicians, and a lot of them end up in Silicon Valley.
Well, those are people that you brought in that were trained elsewhere that you bring into work now, as opposed to maybe trying to get people who are currently in the company up to speed. Or is it just numbers? We just don't have enough.
Well, I think that we have to look at all of the sides of this equation, but the most important thing, I think, is overhauling education. And anywhere I go in the world, it's amazing. Every politician, number one is more investments in education. And it's certainly the direction things are going in this country too. It's absolutely essential.
Is it overhaul in what direction? Right now we're looking at accountability and test scores and those kinds of things. What kind of overhaul is required to be prepared for the future?
Well, I think you have to, first of all, look at content. And the content has to be global. It's almost no way of teaching without this kind of a context anymore. And I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, students come into any college now and they've spent hours and hours on the internet themselves. And they have access to this global village. There's all of the global TV and people traveling more. And so it becomes the only context that makes sense. And I think that we're really seeing that in the whole context of these trade negotiations now. You know, that the issue, of energy, for example. I mean, we're realizing again, we are not energy self-sufficient in this country. No one wants to replay the Gulf War, you know. I mean, the whole idea that it's not, that most of the world's energy supplies, at least petroleum supplies, about 75% of the world's petroleum supplies, guess what? We don't own them. Other countries own them. And so you have to be outward looking, and you have to see what's going on in the rest of the world. But I think the other kind of changes are really about respecting the skills of people that come into the system and realizing that they probably know a lot more than they used to do in an earlier age. And so it's like we're all learning this together.
Well, this is a whole different view of business when you think about it. You talk about democratization of the global economy and the international marketplace. The World Trade Organization issue where people actually picketed. I think a lot of people don't understand what was going on with that.
Well, I think that this is sort of a flowering of democracy around the world. And what people were saying is, hey, in this era of democracy spreading around the world, how come we have an international organization that operates behind closed doors? And there's all of these trade rules being made by economists just around very narrow economic issues, not addressing what happens to the culture of my country, what happens to the environment, what happens to workplace security and workplace rights. And so it was very, very natural. And as a matter of fact, you listen to trade negotiators. Now, I was watching a program recently where on C-SPAN where a lot of trade negotiators, past and present, were talking about their experiences. And every one of them was saying, well, guess what? We can't do it in the back room anymore behind closed doors. The world won't let us.
Well, I know you look at things like that in terms of even trading these credits for pollution and those kinds of things. Are those some of the areas that you're looking at too?
That is going to be a very big area, I believe. You know, this is something that was debated at the UN conference on climate change, and that was in 1999. In Japan, in Kyoto, Japan. And at that time, there were a lot of scientists who said, hey, you know, this global warming thing, climate change is not really happening. Whereas now, there's an almost consensus in the scientific community that this is happening. And what that means is that the countries that have been highly industrialized have really used most of the energy and the materials and created most of the pollution. And so not surprising, up and coming countries like China and India are saying, well, look, you know, as we develop, you're saying now that we can't pollute the way you did. And so the idea is that of trading what are called allowances to pollute. They shouldn't be rights to pollute, but at least these kind of allowances which would equalize and make it fairer between the North and the South. But that is going to be a terrific battle that's going to go on for a long time. And of course, for some countries, they're going to be inundated. I mean, the countries that are really worried are countries like the Maldives, little islands in the Pacific, which are going to be actually uninhabitable, or low-lying areas, you know, like New Orleans and any of the great river estuaries. They're going to be uninhabitable in maybe 50 years because of sea level rise. So all of these issues are totally new. And all of this is going to have to come into education now.
I think so too. It sounds very threatening, because if the United States uses most of the energy and they don't own it, we don't own it, and it's causing this pollution that's causing these environmental issues that are going to impact us all, is the quality of life going to go down?
Unless we start keeping it on the radar screen. And that's where Jacksonville has led the world. And the Jacksonville Quality Indicators for Progress developed here in this city. As you know, there is a constant stream of people from all over the world come to Jacksonville to learn how to do quality of life indicators. And so it's like we have to have more things on the radar screen. You know, it isn't just about economic growth. We have to look at what happens to the environment, what happens to communities, what happens to our cultural traditions, what happens to our history, what happens to human rights. All of those things have to be kept on the radar screen. And so I've prepared a set of quality of life indicators for the USA with the asset management firm that I'm an advisor to, the Calvert Group. And we are now in the process of updating all of these quality of life aspects. And they'll be available on a website pretty soon.
That's wonderful. But you're comparing those quality of life indicators, to what would normally be counted just in GNP or in money terms.
That's right.
How do
yes.
your indicators differ? What are you showing now?
Well, it's quite interesting because everybody has celebrated the economic growth of the Clinton years, and it was pretty extraordinary. And yet, if you look at these other areas of quality of life, which the voters are just as concerned about: education, healthcare, access to healthcare, environment, human rights, culture, recreation, community, assets, all of these kinds of things, shelter. There's good news and bad news. You know, yes, we have more people living in their own homes than ever, but we've also still got an awful lot of homeless people. And we've got 40 million Americans who don't have access to health insurance. And education needs a thorough overhaul, as both of the presidential candidates in the last presidential election talked a great deal about. So this is kind of unfinished business. And it's only if you have it up there on the radar screen and you have it displayed in a way that ordinary voters can watch the quality of life aspects that they're most interested in. You know, if they're interested in education or health, that they can follow those indicators and keep the politicians' feet to the fire.
Do you think people are looking at things more in a systems way, whether they know it or not, as opposed to single issues now, because so many things are interrelated?
Yeah, I really think that message is getting through, you know, and it's horribly confusing that everything is actually connected to everything else.
There's nothing easy.
But on the other hand, we only use 10% of our brain power. And so as we expand, you know, like our TV friends say, we need to pull back and take a wide shot and see this beautiful planet as it is, you know, and there it is. We're all by ourselves in the solar system. We don't think there's any other life on the other planets, at least. Maybe there is out there in the universe, but certainly not in our solar system. And so here we are, the human family, all 6 billion of us, on this planet together with all the other species. And it's extraordinary the way young people today, they took all of this in because they watch animal shows on TV and, they watch, geographic programs and stuff like that. And so they grew up with this. I think that the parents suddenly realize there's no escaping this. We all live on one planet, and it's no good arguing about which end of the boat is sinking. We're all in it together.
Well, I think that's true. I don't know if that's being taught exactly, but I do think that the next generations are beginning to see things because they're seeing what is the result of some pretty bad decision-making in the past.
Yes, and of course you get that decision, the results of bad decisions come up and hit us in the face quicker.
Right.
That's another thing that's happening. I mean, we see that, with the old economic growth model, where suddenly, traffic jams. My gosh, we didn't plan for the new roads. How come the schools are overcrowded? How come the taxes went up because we have to have more firefighters and so on and so forth. And so many communities, not just in the USA, but in Canada, in Europe, in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they're all thinking about these things now. We have to put it all together, and grow our communities in a much more systemic way, where it's kind of more balanced kind of growth.
Well, the question could be, does growth pay or does growth cost? And I think you have a better way of even looking at that, because it does both.
I can remember living in Gainesville when I was at the University of Florida, and there was a whole lot of bumper stickers during one municipal election which blew people's minds, and it said, "Growth raises taxes." And everybody sort of did a double take. And then they realized, oh yes, I mean, if you let developers in and you don't charge them impact fees or require them to pay for schools and roads and fire protection and so on, then the existing taxpayers, indeed, their taxes are going to go up. And, we generally have thought about it the other way around. We bring any kind of growth into our community, and it's going to be great. And then suddenly the bad news comes along.
Well, you can't even insulate yourself. I mean, now Jacksonville is looking at things like, well, we used to recruit almost any kind of business to this town. Now we're being more picky. But does that even really help? Is that really the answer?
Oh, well, I think it helps quite a bit. But it isn't the only thing. I mean, look at the surprise California got at the beginning of 2001, where suddenly they find that they have an energy crisis. And Governor Davis at the time said, well, guess what? This is not really an energy shortage. It's that our utilities are bankrupt. And everybody's saying, how on earth did that happen? Well, the deregulation wasn't done right. And suddenly, everybody in the state is suffering. And what they hadn't noticed is that they have this huge new industry that had been growing up, Silicon Valley, using about 10% of their electricity. And that they hadn't planned for that growth. They said, well, we don't want any more power plants here. We'll sell the power plants. And so, of course, the way out of that kind of mess is not just to rush around and build more power plants, but is to think, what kind of energy is it better to go toward renewable energy, which is not environmentally polluting? And I must say, a personal interest in this, Carol. I've got an investment in a couple of solar energy companies.
Well, you wrote The Politics of the Solar Age. What year was that?
That was 1980.
Okay.
So I was kind of ahead of the market.
So here it is, years later, at least 2 decades later, and now we're beginning to look at that again. But is that a serious look?
Oh, well, I think California has to go in that direction. I mean, clearly, I think there is a consensus in the energy industry worldwide that we will end up with a hydrogen-powered economy, which basically will be non-polluting. And so this is not the time to rush around, and worry only about building power plants that are run on coal or oil or even natural gas. You really have to look to these future technologies, which are going to do 2 things at once: generate the electricity that we need and the energy we need, but also protect the environment as well as creating new jobs. I mean, I was in Taiwan late in the year 2000, and I met with the president, and he has a vision for Taiwan, which he calls the Green Silicon Island. And he sees that it's going to be solar energy, fuel cells, which are really the new way of generating electricity, and solar. Decentralized, so you won't have electric grids everywhere where you have huge transmission losses. You know, sometimes you can lose up to 25% of your power in the transmission lines. And instead, the small factories that they have there will all have on-site solar and fuel cell generators, and the island will be green and clean again. So there are politicians who have these kind of visions. And I think that history will prove that they were fairly far-sighted.
If you were going to give advice to educational institutions or students about future careers or enterprises, what would you say now based on how you foresee the future?
Well, I would say learn to be a systems thinker and see how it all fits together. You know, it's wonderful to have that zoom lens and to get into deep study of the sciences and all of the different disciplines. But remember that we have in our heads always the ability to pull back and take a wide shot and see the thing whole. And that's going to be, I think, the best strategy for a student in terms of keeping their skills upgraded, and also strategically being able to read the newspapers, figure out where things are going, and keep that global focus, because that's the thing that can blindside you, is not having a global focus.
Right. You can't just hunker down and expect it to pass you by and things are going to go back to something good.
No, absolutely no. You can get creamed that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about politicians? What would you say to them about how they can make decisions, or what kinds of things they need to be looking at, because they're setting the policy and putting the money where all these decisions need to be made?
Well, it's getting more and more feedback from the citizens, and in every possible way, taking that feedback, more town meetings, more ways of having community bag lunches, bringing the leaders together, and before you spend all that money, get the feedback, you know, because basically there's two feedbacks from every decision, from ordinary citizens to every decision maker, whether it's politicians or business decision makers, and that is votes and prices. And what we need to do is to make sure that all the votes are counted and that the votes are not influenced and corrupted by money. We need campaign finance reform in this country. And the other thing is we need to make sure the prices of everything are accurate, that they include the social costs and the environmental costs into the price of the products. And then if you've got those two feedbacks, you can steer a lot of those decisions in a better direction. And then, of course, to have those quality of life indicators on your control panel, so you're watching all of the ways that these policies affect each other, as they all do. It's not easy to be a politician.
Oh, no, I don't think it is either. How do you sort this out? How do you, I mean, you write wonderful books, Beyond Globalization, which is one of your smaller ones, but these other ones are very, very complex, and I wonder sometimes if people think that they can just sit on the sidelines and just let it happen.
Oh, a lot of people shut down, you know, from, you know, they say, all this complexity, you know, the only thing I can do is to simplify my life. And in a way, that's a very healthy reaction. I think a lot of us can simplify our lives. You know, we don't have to follow all the latest consumer fads and feel that we're always having to buy stuff to stay ahead and on all of that kind of thing. But what I did, as a matter of fact, with this little book, is that I wanted to compress in less than 100 pages what I thought were all of the best policy proposals that I had heard and seen and listened to at all of those levels of change that are going on, from local communities and families changing the way they work together and play together, all the way up through state level, national government level, and the international level, which in many ways is where the most of the work is migrating to. You know, it's been said that the nation state level is too big for the small problems and too small for the big problems. And some of the big problems now are like this global financial system, which if you're sitting there in an individual country, you can find your currency being destroyed by a bunch of currency traders who decided to make a raid on it and drive the price down and then buy it back cheaper at the bottom. Just the kind of games that used to happen on Wall Street before the great crash in 1929. And so a lot of what's happening now is the need to have international agreements to, you know, they call it the new financial architecture. And our secretaries of the Treasury are very much in support of that. We have to deal with money laundering. We have to deal with international drug trafficking, international mafia. I mean, apparently about 40% of the economy in Russia today is mafia. And so, you know, these are all new problems.
They are new problems.
And this means that our whole approach to national defense and to the military has to change too.
Right. Well, I think you've opened a lot of ideas here, and I think opened people's eyes to how big everything is, and given us some insight to the systems thinker. I really appreciate your time on this program today at FCCJ. And I want to thank Hazel Henderson. The latest book is Beyond Globalization. And that's the one that has those policy issues in it. It might be the one that people want to read to really get some good suggestions. Thank you, Hazel, for being with us.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you all also.